Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 5th of October 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to be joined by David Scott, and of course, David reporting from north of the border with Northern Exposure.
Right, let's get straight on then.
Well, let's get on to the important things, Mike.
National Cyber Security Centre, as everybody will know by now, has exposed all kinds of nastiness by the Russian GRU. And yesterday, the United Kingdom and various G7 allies exposed this campaign via the National Cyber Security Centre, run by Russian military intelligence service, of indiscriminate and reckless cyber attacks targeting political institutions, businesses, media and sport. And they say that the GRU has, the National Cyber Security Centre has identified that a number of cyber actors widely known to have been conducting cyber attacks around the world, widely known, are in fact the GRU. There you go. These attacks have been conducted in flagrant violation of international law, have affected citizens in a large number of countries, including Russia, and have cost national economies millions of pounds. These cyber attacks have attempted to undermine the international sporting institution, the World Anti-Doping Agency, disrupt transport systems in Ukraine, destabilise democracies and target businesses. Now, the BBC's take on this was that they hacked the World Anti-Doping Agency, the Democratic National Committee. They're also blaming the Ukraine, the Ukraine Kiev metro, Odessa airport, Russia's central bank. Strangely enough, the GRU was attacking itself. There you go. And two privately owned Russian media outlets. And lastly, according to the BBC in 2015, an unnamed small UK-based TV station. Don't know who that was. They didn't name them, but there you go. Well, this apparently shows that that the GRU is working in secret to undermine international law and international institutions. Right. Okay. So what did Theresa May have to say about this? Well, she issued a joint statement. And of course, it was pretty much the same as the one she issued at the United Nations General Assembly. Putin did it. Anyone who says otherwise will be silenced. We will continue to start wars overseas with UK aid. Putin did it. Did I tell you that Putin did it? That's not exactly what she said. She said, we have, with the operations exposed today, further shone a light on the unacceptable cyber activities of the Russian military intelligence service, the GRU. It has targeted institutions across the world, including the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. Well, the OPCW produced a statement as well. They said the Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons was briefed today by officials of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands about a cyber operation targeting the OPCW that was disrupted by the Netherlands Defence Intelligence and Security Service. The Netherlands is the OPCW's host country and as such is in charge of ensuring and exercising due diligence in protecting the OPC headquarters. The OPCW thanks the Netherlands for its actions and will remain in contact in regards to any future developments. So what we have is then a coordinated effort here by the British through the National Cyber Security Centre and the Dutch through their equivalent to bring a sort of unified narrative into the news media. So there you go, this is good stuff. In the United States, in the meantime, the Justice Department announced indictments of 7 more alleged GRU agents. 3 had already been indicted for hacking computers associated with 250 athletes and anti-doping sports organizations. And they shut down the Fancy Bears website because that apparently was being run by the GRU. So there you go. Well, as we said, Theresa May and the Dutch Prime Minister issued their joint statement, but then so did Canada, Australia and New Zealand. They issued statements of their own. And of course, this is the rapid response mechanism in action, which was Theresa May announced at the G7 meeting in June, I think it was. And if you remember, the rapid response mechanism is all about coordinated attribution of hostile activity. And this is what we've seen in the last couple of days, coordination between the UK, the Netherlands, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to attribute absolute, without any evidence whatsoever, blame for what's being described as hostile activity. It was the GRU, according to these several coordinated government bodies. And of course, the other thing is joint work to assert a common narrative and response. So this, in my opinion, I'm going to say is conspiracy, Brian, because quite clearly, the governments have been working in concert to produce a narrative with which they can for which they can provide no evidence whatsoever.
No evidence has been produced, Mike, from the start of all of this rhetoric against Russia. Whatever you've looked at, whether it's accusations with the chemical weapons in Syria, wherever you went and said, where is the evidence? There was no evidence produced. It was simply rhetoric through the press and the media, and that's continued. And this is becoming utterly laughable. In just a minute, we're going to have a look at the fact that we now know the British security services were just allowed to carry out criminal acts. That's come to the surface. We have no idea who's doing what at the moment. Do I believe the Russians are so incompetent as to attempt this reckless hacking, leaving a trail behind them? No, I don't.
Workhouse saying in the chat box there that the Daily Mail has an extensive article on this today. Well, it's not just the Mail. At least the Mail only has one. The Times have several, so let's just have a look at some of the headlines. Russian cyber attack, bungling spies left trail of beer cans, receipts and web searches. The Russian cyber attack would be hilarious, were the GRU not so sinister. Fancy Bear, Voodoo Bear and Sandworm, who are the Russian hackers? And the West unites to expose Russian spy attacks. And so it went on. One of our researchers said today that there were about 10 articles on the Times on this one issue. So maybe you could bring David Scott into the program at this point. Welcome to the program, David. Are you convinced by the results of the rapid response mechanism?
Well, it's very impressive in its the fact that it's everywhere, but a few questions do remain. I love the fact that the hacking is both indiscriminate and targeted. Those pesky Russians, only the Russians could have actually come up with that. And it's everywhere in the press. The Sun here, right, nice headline, humiliated Putin is left furious by hapless GRU spies who bungled the Salisbury Novichok sabotage, expert claims. So it transpires that this expert, Mr. Ben McIntyre, can, from his base in North London, when he's not writing for the Times, knows how Mr. Putin is feeling. So that's the sort of high level expertise that we're bringing to this problem. So that's okay.
Yes. I've got to say, David, that people are simply mocking this. So we've got comments in our chat box at the moment that somebody's got a problem with mole hills on their lawn. That's clearly Putin. The GRU's been at work. Somebody's car doesn't perform well. That's GRU. We're now seeing outright mockery at the information being brought into the British press. I think this is very significant, that the British government's narrative is so utterly ridiculous and devoid of evidence that people are simply beginning to laugh. I think this is a very powerful response.
Well, look, let's move on, because here's Andy Price, or rather, there isn't Andy Price, because of course we don't know what he looks like. Actually, if you do a search on the internet for Andy Price, you will find his photograph on a Flickr site, on Flickr site. But of course that's copyright, so we can't use that. But anyway, Andy Price, for those that don't know, works for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He is head of counter-disinformation, but he's also it's head of counter-disinformation and media development. Now, why are we mentioning him again? Well, in fact, yesterday he was speaking at the Atlantic Council at Stratcom. So this is the Atlantic Council will host the Global Forum on Strategic Communications and Digital Disinformation, Stratcom 2018, on October 2nd and 3rd, 2018 in Washington, D.C. So sorry, that was on Wednesday he was speaking. You click there to view the live stream. Now, on Tuesday, the first day of this, it was possible to click there to view the live stream, because the entire day's proceedings were shown. But Andy Price himself, in fact, was on the second day, workshop 3B. The workshop was entitled Addressing Disinformation, Options Available to Government, Civil Society and the Private Sector. So there he is. And strangely enough, the second day, with the exception of a couple of keynote speakers, the second day was not live streamed at all. So unfortunately, it's not possible to show any video of Andy Price in action. We don't know what he looks like in particular just yet, but there we go. Now, what we did discover that he insisted on, rather than he's saying there's not simply disinformation that needs to be dealt with, he's describing it as hostile information operations. So hostile information operations is what we're up against, and of course it's the GRU that is that's I'm sure he would say is doing it now. Yes.
I'll just pick up there, Mike. I think we should point out to our viewers, in case they haven't seen it, that we've got a Mr. Nick Pickles, the senior strategist, public policy, Twitter.
Yes.
And also, I'm particularly interested in Dr. Jennifer Kavanagh there from the RAND Corporation. So, the RAND Corporation, absolutely part of the US military structure. So the British public isn't allowed to know who Mr. Price is, but he's mixing with these individuals discussing what?
Absolutely. Now, if you're wondering why we're saying that the British public isn't allowed to know anything about Andy Price, of course, Andy Price has a public persona in a sense, because he is making statements to the press. He's taking part in these think tank events. But when I put in a freedom of information request to the Foreign Office asking about the size of his team and the scope of his role, we're not allowed to know that on the basis of national security. But we do get a clue that his team seems to be building here. Because here's a job advertisement from a couple of weeks ago. Work with us. The UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office is looking for talented, committed and capable individuals to join us on a 6 to 18-month project basis to counter disinformation and assess hybrid threats. So the team seems to be growing, but we're not allowed to know the size of the team or what its remit is. Now, unfortunately, anybody that's interested in that job, the closing date is now passed, so you can't apply for it. But there you go. The job application was advertised nonetheless. Secret government in operation.
Secret government, and on that job advert, I just happened to notice that they're interested in behavioural matters, because they got behavioural science down there as well.
Absolutely.
So we've constantly got this mix coming in of the high technology, but also behavioural information. Well, can we trust British intelligence services? The answer is, of course, we can't. And this is a very interesting story. It came up. I've only been able to see it very quickly before we've come live today. So encourage people to go and read it, research it themselves. But I think there's some very interesting information. David Cameron gave MI5 agents the license to kill in secret letter, saying they should not be prosecuted for crimes. Tribunal hears. Now, I can't give you details of the tribunal, but just covering the main points of this headline. Absolutely fascinating. This is what Cameron said at the time. In the discharge of their function to protect national security, the security service has a long-standing policy for their agent handlers to agree to agents participating in crime in circumstances where it's considered such involvement is necessary and proportionate in providing or maintaining access to intelligence that would allow the disruption of more serious crimes or threats to national security. So this is a little bit of twist on law. No doubt somebody better informed than me will correct me on this, but I think I'm right in saying that if you were going to apprehend a bank robber and you grabbed a handy item from a shop front, you would technically be stealing, but you were of course taking that item in order to apprehend the robber. So Cameron is playing on the edge of law, but what is clearly coming to the surface is a recognition that if you're MI5, MI6, you can break the law. There's nobody monitoring you. There's nobody hauling you up to account. We've got those rendition flights that certainly the UK column hasn't forgotten about. And what else are British intelligence up to? Are they fabricating chemical weapons attacks? Well, who knows, because they've got a license to break the law. This was a bit more, and this shows you how serious it is. The timing of this letter is said to be highly significant. Just 2 weeks, as just 2 weeks later, Mr. Cameron admitted there was state collusion in the 1989 murder of Belfast solicitor Patrick Finucane. Mr. Finucane, who represented several high-profile Republicans, was shot dead in front of his family by a loyalist gunman. After his death, it emerged that the lawyer's parliamentary intelligence officer responsible for directing the Ulster Defence Association attacks, Brian Nelson, was an agent controlled by the British Army's Force Research Unit. No one has been prosecuted for the murder. Now, we're giving this pretty raw today because we haven't been able to spend a lot of time on it, but we get the idea. In November 2012, Mr. Cameron wrote to retired Judge Sir Michael Waller acknowledging that there was a long-standing secret policy to let security service agents break the law, but the then Prime Minister told him not to rule on whether it was legal and said he need not express any views as to whether any cases should be referred to prosecutors. So remember, they were the same intelligence services that were covering up the abuse of children by politicians in order for what advantage? To bring a large number of politicians to court for abusing children? Well, clearly that wasn't the case because no prosecutions were ever brought. Criminality at the heart of the British deep state, I think, Mike.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to this then. This is the Skripal Files, the life and near death of a Russian spy. It's by Mark Urban. It came out yesterday. Now, Mark Urban works for BBC Newsnight. Craig Murray published this. I just wanted to bring us back a couple of weeks. I think this was at the end of September or so. Imagine if the BBC were honest. Craig Murray saying the BBC refuses to answer my Skripal questions to Mark Urban on the grounds they have no legal obligation, instead giving a statement that correspondence follows below. So do go and have a look at this article in full, because he shows the correspondence between himself and the BBC. Now, this all came out of a Freedom of Information question, which the BBC refused to answer, as they usually do, because they have this exemption whereby if decisions are being made for editorial reasons, they don't have to justify those in any way, shape or form. But what Craig Murray says is there, but what I want you first to imagine is a world in which the BBC and Mark Urban were honest and independent. Imagine these were the answers to my questions. Now, he goes on to ask a whole series of questions about the relationship between Mark Urban and the Skripals. For example, when the Skripals were first poisoned, it was the largest news story in the entire world, and you were uniquely positioned, that's Mark Urban, were uniquely positioned, having held several meetings with Sergei Skripal in the previous year, yet faced with what should have been a massive career break, you withheld that unique information on a major story from the public for 4 months. Why? And Urban said, my interviews with Sergei Skripal were on strictly off the record basis, and I felt honor bound not to mention them until I could obtain his permission. And then Craig Murray asks, you were an officer in the Royal Tank Regiment, together with Skripal's MI6 handler, Pablo Miller, who also lived in Salisbury. Have you maintained a friendship with Miller over the years, and how often do you communicate? And his answer was, I had not heard from Pablo Miller for decades since I left the army. Right now, I'm fascinated by that answer because this is a journalist. He speaks English. He writes in English. He understands grammar. And he understands the difference between present and past tense. And so he said here, I had not heard from Pablo Miller. That absolutely implies to me that he has since heard from Pablo Miller. And there have been communications between Mark Urban and Pablo Miller. He was having to think, which is why he started to slip up with what he was actually saying. Is my guess. Quite possibly. So I think there are many more questions to come out of this, and Craig Murray doing sterling work once again. But Urban's book is now out for anybody that's interested in actually saying what he says about his conversations with Sergei Skripal. I'm not going to recommend it, but it's there if you want it. Okay, well, change of subject and an
introduction to David Scott, really, but let's just have a look very briefly at this. Several people sent this in to us. It's a YouTube video clip which shows a teacher at a primary school encouraging, teaching, showing very small children how to write letters to ask a man, Thomas, to marry them. And the significance of this is that the boys are writing the same letters that the girls are. So the teacher says, there's a couple of clips from the video, you're going to tell Thomas in writing it's a brilliant idea for him to marry you. So this school is teaching children about LBGT relationships from the earliest age, really that is. And of course, you will rapidly learn what's going on because the teacher says that the children can be more accepting at this age. And if you get the information into the children, they accept it now, then you don't have a problem trying to convince them of what they should accept and believe in later years. I looked at the clip several times. It's utterly fascinating. We can actually park the LGBT subject because we can simply say what this teacher is doing is indoctrination, and she knows it's indoctrination, but she thinks this is acceptable. David, I know that this is going on with a vengeance north of the border as well.
It certainly is, and we're seeing it state funded. One of the odd things is that this year there has been LBGT pride marches all around Scotland. There's one in Perth, there's two at the weekend, one in Inverness, one in the Western Isles, if you can believe that. And the Western Isles one, there's a bit of controversy because Western Isles Council is refusing to fly the pride flag. So these are being state funded, well funded. And then what you find is that in each local authority, there are agents pushing agenda. They're often extremely militant, LBGT activists, but they're in state-funded organizations, state-funded jobs, and very often teaching the teachers or in similar areas of control over the wider education system.
Right, David, we're going to move on to ACES, and we'll find out what ACES is in 1 second when we look at a short video clip. So we've got a short video here, and then we've got some stills from the video, but let's find out what ACES is all about.
Hi, this is my neighborhood. I grew up in this building. This is a great community now, but it's had its share of problems. When I was a kid, our community had high unemployment, a lack of resources for families, and lots of kids hanging out with no adult supervision. You might have heard about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are traumatic events in childhood, like abuse and neglect, that can increase risk for future problems. But they don't have to. The good news is that ACEs and their consequences can be prevented.
So, David, ACEs and their consequences can be prevented?
Yes, so this is the latest thing to come out of America, and it's all over Britain. It's all over Western Europe. This is the new thing. It's not that new. It's 20-year-old research, but it's suddenly become the flavor of the month. There's been a film called Resilience, which we can't get to see. It's been shown to all of the Scottish government employees, made by James Redford, and this is describing what they term the science of hope, if you can believe that. And the science of hope is going to show how we're going to transform society by government action. And you have to be hopeful, you have to be optimistic, and you have to, what do you have to do? And they then go on to show correlations between adverse childhood experiences, adverse experiences in early life, and negative outcomes, which on average is true. And we're aware, people in the Fresh Start Foundation is particularly so, we're aware of people who, for example, take to alcoholism in order to self-medicate because of childhood abuse. This is true, this happens. But there's something wider happening here, because what they're doing is they're looking at the statistics of the population as a whole, and then they're taking that and changing it into a decision as to how they're going to influence the lives of individuals, and it becomes government policy, and it starts going into some very strange and very totalitarian areas. So that's what we want to explore here. This next slide is This is from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. So they're so this is a government organization in America. They're pushing this forward. And you see here parent training today. So this is one of the areas that's going to be pushed. We're going to have state-appointed parent trainers. So this is going to reduce the independence of parents within the family within the family unit very significantly. And then they've got, so having identified, initially there's 10 ACEs. It's emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical abuse, etc. And down it goes. Although those numbers are growing now, there's never any limit to these. They've identified, the CDC have identified 5 things they're going to do to stop these happening. So the first one here is strengthening economic supports for families. Now, this means strengthening government subsidies for single parents, essentially. Economic supports means state economic supports, wealth transfers, and of course, it's welfareism that has been the biggest corrosive effect on the family and has caused most of the society-wide decay for those who are most vulnerable. So essentially what we're doing is we're going to double down with everything we've been doing because we don't know what else to do, and we're going to do more of it. Next, we're looking at changing social norms. So the foundation, the bedrock of the family is a bedrock of society is the family, with traditionally one parent, usually the man, providing, and one parent, usually the mother, in a more nurturing role. Well, we're not having that. We're going to change that. So because the state has now stood in the role of the father for providing for the children, we don't need fathers quite as much. So we have a lot of single mothers. And we're going to make that the norm. We're not going to think anything ill of that. We're going to destroy any social propulsion towards the more stable society basis of the family. So that's not going to help. Then we've got quality childcare and education in early life. Odd diagram to illustrate this. This is a little girl playing chess with a wheelchair-bound old lady, maybe a grandmother. We're not sure. Now, that might be an excellent thing to do. I'm not quite sure who's looking after who there. And then after that, we've got enhancing parenting skills. So we've got 2 nice lesbian mothers here who are very slim, and they're outside 24-hour urgent care parenting class this way. So we're going to teach people how to be parents. The state's going to get involved with this as well. And then most creepy of all, we've got intervening to lessen harms and prevent future risk. So the state, right, which isn't very good at making the trains run on time or filling the potholes in the road, is going to prevent future risk. It's going to look into the vibrant, dynamic, complex world of your family, and it's going to decide if you provide a future risk to your parents, to your children, and if you do, if the crystal ball says that's what's going to happen, then they will act to prevent that. And there's no use arguing because, well, you're only a parent. So this is where it's going. It's very similar to the named person scheme. It's very similar to all of the huge lists of parenting outcomes and risk indicators that they had with the named person scheme. It's a slight rebranding of it. It's based on similar American-based pseudoscience. And it's everywhere.
David, it strikes me that
it's
it's
very highest level.
Sorry, David. It strikes me that it's related in some way to social credit, which is something that Dr. Graham Downing was talking to Ian Crane on Humanity versus Insanity last night. We're going to play that program straight after this if you're watching the UK Column live stream. But what you're saying is that there's some kind of measurement made of whether you are a capable parent or not, and if you're not, the state is going to intervene, potentially up to the point of removing the children.
Yes, the state is clearly placing itself in charge, and of course we know that the state is the worst parent of all. So this is the bizarre thing, because the last defense for children is the family unit, and this is assaulting the family unit. So it seems superficially plausible, but when you actually analyze what it's doing, it's all acting against children. Now, the next slide here is adverse childhood experiences. This is from the Scottish Government website. So this is the initial ones were from America for the Centers for Disease Control. It's been parroted in Scotland. Now they've put a saltire on it, and they're going to say this is really important and Scotland's going to lead the world. No, 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 no. Scotland's just doing as it's told, as it always seems to do these days. Now some of the other things that are coming out, it's called the theory of everything. Okay, so the idea here is this explains everything. This explains everything about your life. This explains everything about your future. And there's always a pyramid, right? We don't seem to be able to do these without using pyramids to explain diagrammatically. So here's the pyramid for ACEs. Now this, as you see, goes from conception to death, right? So this is the theory of everything. And you see down the bottom, you've got adverse childhood experiences, and then that allegedly causes disrupted neurodevelopment, which allegedly causes social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which allegedly gives rise to the adoption of high-risk behaviors, which then allegedly cause disease and social problems and an early death. So there you go. It's all baked in there. Now, I was having a quick look at some of the Scottish Government support for this. Nicola Sturgeon was at a conference in March this year. She was reflecting on the powerful impact that the Resilience documentary had on her, and emphasised the importance of considering and tackling ACEs, stating that ACEs is one of the most important discussions currently taking place across the Scottish Government. So it is being pushed by our own government. And our old friend, Professor Sir Harry Burns, the man with all the slides from the World Bank to tell us how we have to intervene in family life, he told the audience about the original study and Felicity's accidental realization that many of those attending his obesity clinic had been sexually abused in childhood. And you see here, there is a core truth to this, right? That you've got a lot of abuse, you've got a lot of particularly sexual abuse, but rather than tackling that, what we're doing is we're using it as an excuse to build the state into an ever more powerful vehicle for controlling society. So that's what's happening here. Now, the next little bit is just a shocker. This is from the Journal of Applied Philosophy, and it is awful. And it's Licensing Parents Revisited. Now, this is one of the most disturbing and in many ways ignorant articles I think I've ever read. See, he first of all makes the case for licensing professionals. And it's all positive. You know, people engage in activity, they may harm those they serve, either directly or by failing to fulfill the fiduciary duties, and the harm can be significant. So we need the state to get in there and regulate them. Now, we don't, because there are contraindications here. But what he ignores is that licensing is very often used by professions to limit access, to ring fence money, and to drive up fees. It's not what he's claiming, but he skirts over any real negative effects, and then goes on to make the case that, well, parenting is very important, and then we should license parenting because we need competence. We need to make sure parents are competent. And it briefly looks at the fact that, well, we don't really know how to do that, but it'll be okay. And then he looks at the right to have children, which he's not very impressed with. He says, perhaps though the objector has something different in mind, it's only she, there are no men referring to this, she may think that people have the right to their children, whereas people do not have a right to be professionals. And also goes, and then the conclusion is, does a parent have a right to rear the children under her control without interference from the state? And there's again a false choice here between a parent who might be abusive and one with no state involvement at all, or complete control. And then the case for independence of family life is broken down, and the conclusion is, yes, we have a good theoretical case for licensing parenting. This sort of thing, which seems crazy, I think is on the way in, and we should be very careful for bad philosophical ideas driving into our government and then into our lives.
David, I've got to say, as you went through that, this is clearly coming in. It's coming in as policy. that policy coming in through the civil service, but very often we can see that a lot of it originates with the United Nations. But this is very, very dark and sinister stuff. One of the points you've just made is that we allow the abuse of the children to take place because ultimately this form of control over parents and families can be brought in as an excuse over the top of it. So what better place to go than the ICSA, the Theresa May's child abuse inquiry, because it's just been talking about its findings in Nottingham. And they've mentioned Beechwood Children's Home, of course, where Melanie Shaw was abused, and Melanie then became the lead whistleblower. So Sky News here says one of the most notorious children's homes in Nottingham, known as Beechwood, has been singled out by the inquiry for special investigation. There were 136 allegations of sexual abuse from children there between the 1960s and 1990s. And of course, this is a special investigation of Beechwood because the lead whistleblower, Melanie Shaw, has never been called to give evidence to that inquiry. On the contrary, the inquiry has done everything it possibly can to make sure that Melanie doesn't come in front of the inquiry to give her evidence. So the lead whistleblower of abuse in Beechwood has not appeared at the inquiry. They're not interested in speaking to Melanie. And as their media lady said to me in a slightly agitated state, what do you expect us to do? Break into the prison style in order to get Melanie? Well, what's going on here, I think, is becoming pretty clear. This is John Mann, MP. He says it is a total betrayal. The system didn't work for them. The institutions didn't even cooperate and hardly talk to each other. It's quite astonishing how they were let down. This is institutional failure, but we need to learn for the present and the future. I thought I'd just slap a label across this because, of course, this is not institutional failure. This is criminal activity. And the evidence is easy to see that the institutions fully cooperated in the abuse and the subsequent cover-up. So I'm not sure what Mr. Mann's plan is here. He's apparently representing 3 of the abuse victims. I called his office before we became live today in order to see what he had to say about the fact the lead whistleblower, Melanie Shaw, hadn't been called, but there was nobody to answer the telephone. We'll try him again this afternoon. BBC is on the bandwagon. Now remember, of course, that this is the same BBC that has removed all of their earlier articles about Beechwood and the abuses and those that featured Melanie Shaw, but they are telling us that 3 witnesses gave evidence, who gave evidence on Tuesday, had all been through branches of Beechwood Community Home in Mapley. The facility is one of 3 case studies for the Nottingham branch of the inquiry, which opened at Trent Bridge on Monday. A woman in her 50s, identified only as D7, said she grew up in Marshfield and went into care into the 1970s. She recalled being attacked on several occasions by John Dent, a social worker who lived on the site. So there we are. Remarkably, this particular victim of Beechwood, who says that children were not only abused but murdered on that site, has been completely blocked so far from this inquiry. David, I predicted a very long time ago that ICSA would be a cover-up. I believe now even more that this is a very carefully crafted government cover-up as to the scale of the abuse and the links through to high-level abusers in the establishment and the political system in Westminster. And the fact that you are now reporting on Beechwood without even interviewing the lead whistleblower says to me that I've been correct. Sorry to be a little bit arrogant there. What do you feel about ICSA?
Well, look what it's doing. It's now been running for how many years? Exactly how many shocking headlines have we seen? How many politically connected people have been charged? How many have resigned in disgrace? How many changes have been made? There's been nothing. What it is a nice, quiet, gentle ease down from where we were 3-4 years ago, where we had daily headlines again about people like Leon Britton and what he was up to with small boys, and a general view that the people who rule over us had shown themselves to be utterly corrupt. And now this is just easing the public down gently. So there'll be some lessons to be learned. There might be a few low-level people thrown to the wolves. But what's going to change? I don't see any momentum here for change.
No, and of course you need the abused children, because as you've demonstrated, if you have the abused children who go through life damaged and suffering, the state can then use that to bring in controls over parents who do look after their children. But this little part of the story gets worse, because it was kindly pointed out to us that the Independent Monitoring Board had recently produced a report on HM Prison Style, where Melanie, of course, has been held. This is the board. It's independent. It's always important to tell people that. It's an independent board appointed by the Secretary of State, by members of the community in which the prison centre is situated. Now, I spoke to a very nice lady at this organisation this morning, and I questioned her about this report. I've been invited to email the board, although I'm not to know who's on the board at the moment. But why did I have questions? Well, I had questions because the report that they wrote has concluded that prisoners are overall treated fairly in the prison, although a small number with poor English are at a disadvantage. Are prisoners treated humanely? The view of the board is that prisoners are treated humanely by staff in the prison. However, conditions are adversely affected by the poor state of the building. So overall, this is a good report for this prison. But when we get into the text, there's some interesting things here. Because it said over the reporting year, 5 women have spent between 31 and 42 days on the separation, the segregation unit under Rule 45 or Rule 49. A 6th woman arrived on the unit under this provision on 7th of November, and despite several unsuccessful efforts to begin a return to normal location, remains there at the time of writing with appropriate authorization. The unit is not ideal for anyone to spend more than a few days. Now, some people suggest that this particular person they're referring to is Melanie Shaw. I believe that could well be true. But I simply asked the question of the board, if people were spending a long time in a unit where you should only be for a few days, how is this humane? And they seem to get rather confused by my question, hence the invitation to email them. I'll just add in this from the report, because if you go into the depths of this report, they've got a massive increase in self-harm and mental health issues that's occurred over the last few months. And it's interesting that the prison governor has recently had to step down, although the Ministry of Justice at the moment will not tell anybody the reasons that she's been removed from the prison. So HMP Style at the moment is effectively out of control. It doesn't have a proper governor. The government who appoints people who do the inspection isn't saying why this lady has been removed. But we seem to have another report smoothing the waters, although the conditions in that prison are pretty unpleasant. And I'll just pop this image up, which I did tweet out yesterday. But as I watched Theresa May cavorting on stage in front of her adoring Conservative audience, I thought, yes, this is the dancing queen that, of course, was responsible for putting Melanie Shaw in prison. Melanie has finished her jail term, but is still 3 months later, I think it is 3 months later, is still in prison, still not receiving the mental health needs that she deserves. So well done, Theresa May. David, very quickly, because we're on the stops for time, Britain is out of control on this issue, I think is the best way I can put this.
It is, and it's not just Britain. We're seeing the same in Holland. We're seeing the same in Ireland. We're seeing the same in America. Just to finish here, this is a blog called The Freeman Perspective. written by Paul Rosenberg. What he says is, these days what is legal is controlled by a corrupt political elite. The law contradicts its own foundational statements. It's impossible to know it in its entirety. It is enforced arbitrarily. Reason is no longer a tool of safety. The actions that may trigger punishment cannot be fully understood. The enforcer class will hurt you upon command, asking no questions as to right. Our forefathers would have called this tyranny. What shall we do? In this situation, three particular actions make sense. One, stop taking laws created by a representative class seriously from any moral standpoint. They are the edicts of people who employ enforcers and nothing more. Their invocations of constitutions and higher powers are sucker bait. Two, we do unfortunately need to be aware of how the enforcers are hurting people. There is value in staying safe. And three, we should start building our own ways of obtaining safety and justice. I think that is wonderful.
Excellent.
Leave it there.
Okay, well, we will leave it there today. Thank you, David, for joining us. Thank you to those who've tuned in to watch live. Thank you to our audience who listen. And thank you very much to people who are donating and subscribing. If you're not yet a subscriber to the UK Column, please consider making that subscription, because we can only do what we do with your financial support. We will be back on Monday, and we are looking forward next week to having Alex Thompson back with us, who will be commenting on interesting matters. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.